If you think the alcohol completely cooks off out of your food, you're wrong. It's the most widely accepted myth in the culinary world. We've all heard it from grandmothers and culinary school instructors. Just simmer for 20 minutes. The boiling point of alcohol is lower than water. It all burns off. It sounds like perfectly logical science, but it's completely false. And chefs aren't lying to you. We are just being tricked by chemistry. Our eyes and noses deceive us. And the United States government has the data to prove it. Back in 1992, the USDA tested our favorite cooking methods. The results were shocking. Take the legendary flambe, for example. You light the pan on fire, the flames shoot up, the fire dies out. You assume the booze is completely gone, right? Wrong. The fire is a beautiful visual illusion. It only burns the vapors hovering above the pan. A massive, shocking percentage of the alcohol is still sitting right there in your sauce. And if you think a long simmer fixes the problem, you are fighting an invisible war against hydrogen bonds. A war that you cannot win with just a hot stove. Let me show you the chemistry of why your food is still drunk. To understand why we've been getting this so wrong, we have to look at the golden age of television cooking, the Julia Child era. For decades, the culinary consensus was absolute. If you add wine to a hot pan, the alcohol evaporates. You are left with only the rich, complex flavors of the spirit. And honestly, it sounds like basic, undeniable logic. It all comes down to boiling points. Pure water boils at 112 degrees Fahrenheit, but pure ethanol, it boils much lower, at just 173 degrees. So most common sense dictates a very simple narrative. When your skillet hits 173 degrees, the alcohol must turn into vapor. It should vanish before the water even starts to bubble. It seems completely foolproof, especially because your own senses are backing up the theory. When you first deglaze a pan with wine, a harsh, boozy cloud of steam hits your face. A few minutes later, that sharp smell is gone. Your nose tells you the ethanol has officially left the building. The problem? Your nose is a terrible chemist. You are only smelling the most volatile surface molecules escaping. Because boiling points are not magical delete buttons. And beneath the surface of your sauce, a microscopic hostage situation is taking place. When we pour wine into a hot skillet, we aren't just adding flavor. We are introducing pure ethanol into a predominantly water-based environment. And water is incredibly clingy. At a molecular level, water and ethanol don't act like oil and vinegar. They don't just sit next to each other waiting to be separated by heat. Instead, they form a chemical alliance. It's a scientific phenomenon known as a zeotropic mixture. And yes, I had to practice pronouncing that in the mirror before I hit record. But all jokes aside, here is what that actually means for your dinner. Because of the strong hydrogen bonds, the water molecules literally grab onto the ethanol molecules. They hold hands, they lock together, they refuse to let go. This means the water acts like a heavy chemical anchor. It physically traps the alcohol right there in the pan. As we reduce that beautiful red wine glaze, we aren't just boiling off the booze. We are evaporating both the water and the alcohol simultaneously. They leave the skillet together. You literally cannot boil them apart cleanly. Even as the liquid reduces by half, the remaining sauce is still thoroughly spiked. That makes it progressively harder to strip out those last stubborn molecules. The remaining alcohol is fiercely protected by the water, fats, and proteins around it. And that invisible war we talked about, even though it's at a molecular level and we are fighting it with a wooden spoon, we are still losing. So if boiling water won't save us, what about fire? Surely setting the whole pan ablaze eradicates the booze, right? Well, get ready to have your culinary heart broken. Let's address the most dramatic technique in the kitchen, the flambe. You pour liquor into a hot pan and ignite it. A massive fireball erupts towards the ceiling. The flames dance for a few seconds, then they naturally die out. It looks like you just incinerated every last drop of alcohol. But that fire is completely lying to you. In 1992, researchers at the University of Idaho teamed up with the USDA. Dr. George Augustine and his team decided to actually test the math. They didn't just taste the food to see if it was boozy. They used gas liquid chromatography and injected samples of Grand Marnier sauce, scallop oysters, and burgundy pot roast into a machine. This machine separates and measures exact molecular compounds. It is impossible to fool. So when the numbers came back, there was no room for debate. They published a landmark study that shattered culinary folklore. Here is the smoking gun on the flambe. When you ignite that pan, the fire doesn't touch the bulk liquid. It only burns the highly concentrated ethanol vapors hovering right above the surface. Once that vapor drops below a specific concentration, the fire starves. The flames go out. But the liquid in the pan is still heavily spiked. The USDA proved that a standard flambe leaves a staggering 75% of alcohol behind. That is the shocking number we talked about earlier. You are basically just warming up the liquor and putting on a light show. But what about the slow and steady approach? What if you simmer the sauce for a really long time? The USDA tested that too. And the numbers are brutal. If you bake or simmer a dish for 15 minutes, 40% of the alcohol survives. If you let it bubble away for a full hour, a solid 25% still swimming in your dinner. Even if you braise a roast for 2.5 hours, you are still leaving roughly 5% of the original ethanol in the pot. But time and temperature are only half the battle. Why? Because the hardware in your kitchen is actually fighting against you. It is actively forcing the booze right back into your food. If you want to get rid of the alcohol, well, evaporation is the only way out. And evaporation only happens at the surface level of the liquid. If you are reducing wine in a tall, narrow soup pot, you are actively trapping the booze. There simply isn't enough surface area for the ethanol to escape. A wide, shallow skillet is going to reduce the alcohol significantly faster. But the shape of your pan isn't the only variable. The food itself is working against you. Food scientists call this the food matrix. When you add alcohol to a dish loaded with starches, proteins, and fats, things get complicated. This acts as a physical barrier. It slows down the movement of the volatile molecules trapping the ethanol deep inside the food. Then there is the absolute biggest offender in your kitchen, the lid. Let's say you're braising short ribs in red wine. You let it simmer low and slow, a solid 3 hours. You think the alcohol is long gone, but if you left the lid on the pot, you just created a closed thermodynamic loop. The ethanol vaporizes, rises up, hits the cold underside of the lid, and immediately condenses. Then it rains right back down onto your dinner. So those brutal USDA retention numbers we just talked about, those assume you are cooking with an uncovered pan. If you cook with the lid on, you are retaining almost all of the alcohol. But there is another variable you completely control: the timing of your pour. Modern food chemists ran a series of tests to track ethanol loss. They found a massive difference based on when the alcohol hits the pan. If you pour wine over cold ingredients before turning on the stove, you are going to retain significantly more alcohol. But if you pour that same wine into an already boiling liquid, the volatile rapid evaporation strips out the ethanol much faster. For example, a fish stew with wine added cold retained 30% of its alcohol. A beef stew with wine added at a rolling boil, it dropped all the way down to 5%. Timing is literally everything. But what happens when you don't even add the alcohol yourself? What if you never poured a single drop of alcohol into the recipe? What if the food was making its own booze behind your back? Researchers measuring beer-cooked food stumbled onto a fascinating anomaly. Sometimes the final dish had more ethanol than the recipe mathematically allowed. Where did the extra alcohol come from? The yeast. When you bake certain artisan breads or fermented doughs, yeast eats sugars. The natural byproduct of that feast is carbon dioxide and pure ethanol. So even a totally innocent loaf of sourdough is quietly producing its own hidden alcohol. It gets trapped right inside the crumb structure. You aren't just failing to cook out the alcohol you added, you are literally baking new alcohol into existence. So, with all that hidden ethanol sneaking past the stove and the oven, is it actually possible to get buzzed off a plate of penne alla vodka? And who is actually at risk when we ignore the science? Let's be completely honest for a second. Are you gonna get drunk off some bourbon short ribs? Well, unless you eat your body weight in short ribs, absolutely not. Say you simmer a cup of wine in a massive pot roast for 3 hours. That stubborn 5% retention is spread across the entire dish. For the average adult, a single serving might contain just 1 gram of ethanol. Your liver processes that before you even finish dessert. But the math completely changes when you are only cooking for yourself. Say you deglaze a single piece of chicken with a heavy pour of white wine. You do a quick 5-minute pan sauce and plate it up. You aren't spreading that retained alcohol across 8 different portions. You are eating every last drop of it. And since a quick pan sauce retains up to 75% of the original alcohol, that single plate is carrying a highly concentrated dose of ethanol. So why does this really matter? Because it is about knowing exactly what is in your food. For millions of people, any measurable amount of alcohol is a serious problem. Think about the recovering alcoholic ordering a braised short rib at a restaurant. They take a bite and immediately taste the sharp notes of a burgundy reduction. Panic sets in, but the waiter promises them it's perfectly safe because the alcohol has cooked out. We know that's a biological lie. The same goes for pregnant women, young children, and individuals with strict religious dietary laws. Well-meaning parents are feeding their toddlers beer cheese soup right now. But this doesn't mean you need to banish wine and bourbon from your kitchen forever. Alcohol is a culinary superpower when used correctly. You just need to know exactly how and why to use it. And this incredible culinary tool is a molecular solvent. It unlocks flavor compounds in tomatoes and meat that water and fat simply cannot touch. You should absolutely keep deglazing your pans with white wine. You should absolutely keep making that bourbon glaze. Just stop pretending the alcohol magically vanishes into thin air. Understand the thermodynamics of your skillet. Respect the food matrix and the azeotropic mixtures you create. If you're cooking for kids or someone avoiding alcohol, find a substitution. Use a splash of vinegar, Burgess, or a thick stock instead. Because when we stop relying on old kitchen myths and start respecting the chemistry, we become better, smarter cooks. And we stop accidentally serving spiked dinners to our guests. Eat well, question what's in your food, and I'll see you on the next one.